Hi, I'm Kira. 3 weeks ago, I came home to find an eviction notice taped to my apartment door. The man who served it claimed to be my new landlord and gave me 72 hours to pack my life into boxes. What he didn't know was that I had been recording our conversation on my phone. What my parents didn't know was that the real landlord was standing right behind him, and she had been recording too. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain drummed against the tall windows of my studio apartment above Milestone Books, creating patterns on the glass that shifted like watercolors bleeding into each other. I loved the sound, especially on Thursday afternoons when the bookstore below was quiet and I could spread my art therapy materials across the hardwood floor without worrying about disturbing anyone. The space wasn't much to look at. Maybe 400 square feet with exposed brick walls and a Murphy bed that squeaked when you pulled it down, but it was mine. More importantly, it was affordable, something increasingly rare in Portland's Hawthorne district. Miss Anoushka Petrov had been my landlord for almost 2 years. She was a soft-spoken woman in her 70s who emigrated from Ukraine decades ago and still spoke with a gentle accent that made even mundane conversations about rent feel warm. She owned the entire Victorian duplex and lived in the larger unit downstairs, while I rented the converted studio above the bookstore she also owned. The arrangement worked perfectly for both of us. I helped her with small maintenance tasks and kept an eye on the property, while she charged me well below market rate because, as she often said, she remembered what it was like to be young and struggling in a new place. That Thursday afternoon, I was working on a painting for my senior thesis, exploring themes of displacement and belonging through mixed media. The irony wasn't lost on me later. I had my headphones on, completely absorbed in layering translucent blues and grays, when I heard heavy footsteps on the external staircase that led to my door. Mrs. Petrov always knocked softly and called out in her musical accent, so I knew immediately this wasn't her. The knocking was sharp, authoritative, the kind that demanded immediate attention. I wiped my hands on a paint rag and walked to the door, checking the peephole. A man in his 40s stood there wearing a cheap suit and holding a manila folder. Behind him, partially obscured, I could make out another figure, but the angle made it impossible to see clearly. When I opened the door, the man didn't wait for pleasantries. He thrust the folder toward me with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Kira Valdez, I'm Robert Chen, the new property manager. This building has been sold, and I'm here to inform you of immediate changes to your tenancy. Something felt wrong immediately. Mrs. Petrov had never mentioned selling, and we had just renewed my lease 3 months earlier. She was meticulous about communication and would never have kept something this significant from me. But the man's confidence was unsettling, and the official-looking documents in the folder made me second-guess my instincts. I think there's been a mistake, I said carefully. Ms. Petrov owns this building, and she hasn't mentioned anything about selling. The man's expression didn't change. Mrs. Petrov is no longer the owner. The sale was finalized last week. You'll find all the relevant documentation in your folder, along with your 72-hour notice to vacate. My stomach dropped. 72 hours? That's not legal. Oregon law requires at least 30 days for no-cause evictions, and even then, there are specific procedures that have to be followed. He shrugged with practiced indifference. The new ownership has discovered significant building code violations that make immediate vacancy necessary for safety reasons. Everything is documented. You can dispute it in court if you want, but you'll still need to be out by Sunday. I felt my hands beginning to shake, but I kept my voice steady. Can I see some identification and documentation of the sale? The man reached into his jacket pocket, but before he could produce anything, I heard a familiar voice from the stairway below. Excuse me, but what exactly is happening here? Mrs. Petrov appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her silver hair pulled back in its usual neat bun, but her normally gentle demeanor had shifted into something I'd never seen before. She looked furious. The man calling himself Robert Chen barely glanced at her. Ma'am, This is private business between the new management and the tenant. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Mrs. Petrov climbed the stairs slowly, deliberately, her eyes never leaving the man's face. When she reached the landing, she stood directly in front of him, despite being at least a foot shorter. I am Anoushka Petrov, and I own this building. I have owned it for 23 years. Who are you and why are you harassing my tenant? The color drained from the man's face, but he tried to maintain his composure. There must be some confusion. The paperwork clearly shows the transfer of ownership. Perhaps you should contact your real estate agent. Mrs. Petrov's laugh was sharp and cold. Young man, I think you are the one who is confused. This building has never been for sale. I suggest you leave immediately before I call the police. That's when I noticed the figure who had been standing behind the fake landlord step forward slightly, and my heart stopped. It was my father, Vincent Valdez. He was trying to stay in the shadows, probably hoping I wouldn't notice him, but the afternoon light caught his profile, and there was no mistaking him. Dad? The word came out as barely a whisper. Miss Petrov turned to look at me, then followed my gaze to my father. Her expression shifted from anger to something much more dangerous. Mr. Valdez? What are you doing here? My father had met Mrs. Petrov several times when he helped me move in. She had always been gracious to him, offering tea and asking about his home staging business. Now, she was looking at him like she was seeing him for the first time. I think we should all calm down, my father said, stepping fully into view. There's obviously been some miscommunication here. But Mrs. Petrov wasn't interested in his diplomatic tone. She pulled out her phone and, without taking her eyes off the fake landlord, dialed a number. Portland Police, please. I need to report someone impersonating a property manager and attempting to illegally evict my tenant. The man calling himself Robert Chen suddenly became very interested in leaving. This is clearly a civil matter that should be handled between property owners. I think there's been a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, Mrs. Petrov said calmly, is you attempted to defraud my tenant with falsified documents. That is not a civil matter. As the fake landlord hurried down the stairs, my father lingered for a moment, looking like he wanted to say something, but Mrs. Petrov's steely gaze apparently changed his mind, and he followed the other man down the steps without a word. I stood in my doorway holding the manila folder, trying to process what had just happened. The documents inside looked official enough, complete with letterhead and legal language, but they were entirely fabricated. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create a convincing eviction notice, and my father had been part of it. Miss Petrov waited until she heard car doors slam and an engine start before turning to me. Her expression softened immediately. Kira, dear, are you all right? Do you know why your father would be involved in something like this? I shook my head, though I was beginning to suspect I did know. My relationship with my parents had been strained for months, ever since I decided to stay in Portland for graduate school instead of moving back home to Lake Oswego after finishing my bachelor's degree. They had wanted me to live at home, help with the family business, and follow the path they had mapped out for me. When I chose independence instead, the tension had escalated steadily, but this was beyond family disappointment. This was elaborate, calculated, and cruel in a way that made me question everything I thought I knew about the people who raised me. Mrs. Petrov invited me downstairs for tea while we waited for the police to arrive. Her living room was exactly what you'd expect from someone who owned a bookstore, with floor-to-ceiling shelves, comfortable mismatched furniture, and the kind of warm lighting that made you want to curl up with a novel and forget the outside world existed. As she prepared the tea, I found myself studying the framed photographs on her mantelpiece. Most were black and white, showing a much younger Mrs. Petrov in various locations around the world. In one, she stood in front of what looked like a university building, wearing graduation robes and beaming at the camera. That was when I got my law degree, she said, noticing my attention. 19. I practiced immigration law for 15 years before I bought this building and decided I preferred books to courtrooms. That explained the steel beneath her grandmotherly exterior. It also explained why she had handled the fake landlord with such precision and confidence. Miss Petrov, I said carefully, do you think my parents orchestrated this whole thing? She sat down across from me, her teacup balanced delicately in her hands. I think your parents hired someone to frighten you into moving out. Whether they understood the legal implications of what they were doing, I cannot say, but the intent seems clear. The police arrived 20 minutes later. Officer Martinez was professional and thorough, taking statements from both Miss Petrov and me, photographing the fake documents, and asking detailed questions about the men who had served them. When I mentioned that one of them was my father, her expression didn't change, but I caught her making an additional note. We'll follow up on this, she said, handing me her card. In the meantime, I'd recommend documenting everything. If this escalates, you'll want a complete record. After the police left, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the fake eviction notice. The attention to detail was impressive and disturbing. Someone had researched property management companies in Portland, created convincing letterhead, and even included citations to actual housing laws, though they had misapplied them completely. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Hope you're having a good week, sweetie. Don't forget about Sunday dinner. The casual normalcy of the message felt surreal after what had just happened. Did she think I wouldn't figure out what they had done? Did they expect me to show up for family dinner and pretend nothing had happened? I screenshot the message, added it to a new folder on my phone labeled Evidence, and tried to decide what to do next. Part of me wanted to drive straight to Lake Oswego and confront them, but I knew that would be exactly what they were hoping for. They wanted me emotional, off balance, and easy to manipulate back into their control. Instead, I did something they probably weren't expecting. I called Zara Okafor, my best friend since sophomore year, and the most level-headed person I knew. Zara was studying journalism, and had an instinct for uncovering hidden truths that made her both an excellent friend and a formidable opponent to anyone who tried to deceive her. They did what? Zara's voice rose an octave when I finished explaining the afternoon's event. I know how it sounds, but I have witnesses, photographs, and police documentation. This actually happened. Kira, this is insane. Why would your parents go to these lengths instead of just talking to you? It was a good question, and one I'd been asking myself. The answer, I suspected, had to do with control and image. My parents had always been concerned with appearances, with maintaining the narrative that they were a successful, harmonious family. My decision to live independently and pursue art therapy instead of joining their staging business had disrupted that narrative. But there was something else. Something I was only beginning to understand. My independence wasn't just inconvenient for them, it was threatening. For reasons I couldn't fully articulate yet, they needed me back under their roof, and under their control. I think, I told Zara slowly, there's more to this story than just wanting me to move home. I think they're afraid of something. Afraid of what? I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. That evening, I made myself a simple dinner, and tried to return to my painting, but concentration was impossible. Every sound from the street made me tense, wondering if the fake landlord might return with reinforcements, or if my parents might show up to attempt some other form of manipulation. Around 9 o'clock, Mrs. Petrov knocked on my door. She was carrying a steaming mug, and wore the expression of someone who had been thinking hard about a complex problem. I brought you some chamomile tea, she said, and I have a proposition. I invited her in, grateful for the company and curious about what she had in mind. I've been thinking about this afternoon, she began, settling into my single armchair. What your parents did was not just cruel, it was illegal. Impersonating a property manager, creating fraudulent documents, attempting to illegally evict a tenant. These are serious crimes. I nodded, though I wasn't sure where she was going with this. I also think, she continued, that this was not a spontaneous decision. This required planning, research, and money. People don't hire fake landlords on a whim. She was right. The man calling himself Robert Chen had been too polished, too prepared. This was a professional operation. What are you thinking? I asked. Mrs. Petrov smiled, and for the first time since I'd known her, there was something slightly predatory in her expression. I'm thinking that your parents may have made a very expensive mistake, and I'm thinking that my law degree might be useful after all. We talked for another hour, with Mrs. Petrov, explaining various legal concepts and potential remedies. By the time she left, I had a much clearer understanding of what my parents had done and what options were available to me. I also had something I hadn't expected: an ally. Mrs. Petrov wasn't just my landlord anymore. She was my partner in whatever was about to unfold. That night, I lay in my Murphy bed, listening to the rain, and thinking about the photograph on Mrs. Petrov's mantelpiece. The young woman in graduation robes looked determined and hopeful, ready to take on the world, armed with knowledge and dust. I thought I was beginning to understand that feeling. My phone buzzed one more time before I fell asleep. Another text from my mother. Can't wait to see you Sunday. Dad's making his famous barbecue sauce. I screenshot this message too and added it to my evidence folder. Then I turned off my phone and closed my eyes, already planning what tomorrow would bring. They thought they could manipulate me back into their world through fear and deception. What they didn't realize was that they had just given me every reason to discover exactly what they were so desperate to hide, and thanks to Mrs. Petrov, I now had the legal expertise to do it properly. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Portland feel like a postcard, but I barely noticed the beauty outside my window. I had been awake since 5, sitting cross-legged on my hardwood floor with my laptop open, diving deep into research that was revealing far more than I had bargained for. Mrs. Petrov had given me a crash course in tenant rights law the night before, but she had also suggested I investigate the man who had posed as Robert Chen. Using the description I had given to the police, and some creative searching on social media and professional networking sites, I had found him within 2 hours. His real name was Marcus Hoffman, and he wasn't just some random actor my parents had hired off Craigslist. He was a licensed private investigator who specialized in what his website euphemistically called family intervention services. His LinkedIn profile was a masterclass in corporate doublespeak, describing his work as helping families navigate complex relationship dynamics through strategic communication solutions. What that actually meant became clearer as I dug deeper into his client testimonials and case studies. Marcus Hoffman helped wealthy families manipulate their adult children back into compliance. He had testimonials from parents who praised his ability to redirect wayward daughters and restore family harmony through targeted pressure campaigns. The more I read, the sicker I felt. This wasn't just about my parents wanting me to move home. This was about control, and they had hired a professional to help them exert it. But Marcus Hoffman's involvement raised uncomfortable questions. His services weren't cheap. According to the pricing structure buried in his website's FAQ section, a comprehensive family realignment consultation started at $5,000, with additional fees for fieldwork and documentation service. My parents had spent serious money on this scheme, money that suggested they were more desperate than I had realized. I was so absorbed in my research that I almost missed the soft knock at my door. Mrs. Petrov stood on my landing, holding a paper bag that smelled like fresh pastries and wearing the expression of someone who had been busy. I brought breakfast, she said, and information, over coffee and what turned out to be exceptional blueberry scones from the bakery down the street. Mrs. Petrov shared what she had discovered during her own investigation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As a former immigration lawyer, she still had contacts throughout Portland's legal community, and she had spent the early morning making phone calls. Marcus Hoffman is well known among family law attorneys, she said, spreading cream cheese on her scone with the precision of someone who had spent decades handling delicate matters. Not well regarded, but well known. He operates in a legal gray area, providing services that are technically legal but ethically questionable. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Several attorneys I spoke with mentioned that Hoffman typically works with parents who are concerned about losing financial control over their adult children. Often, there are trust funds or inheritance issues involved. I set down my coffee cup, a new possibility forming in my mind. Miss Petrov, do you think this could be about money? Something beyond just wanting me to move home? I think, she said slowly, that we need to examine your family's financial situation more carefully. People don't hire Marcus Hoffman unless the stakes are very high. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since high school. I called my brother Dominic. Our relationship had always been complicated, shaped by the fact that he was the golden child who had followed every one of our parents' expectations while I had consistently disappointed them. Dominic had studied business at Portland State, joined the family company immediately after graduation, and built a successful social media presence around minimalism and intentional living that perfectly complemented our parents' home staging business. But despite our differences, Dominic wasn't cruel, and I hoped he might be willing to help me understand what was really happening. Kira, he sounded genuinely surprised to hear from me. Is everything okay? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Jim, did you know that Mom and Dad hired someone to fake evict me from my apartment yesterday? The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When Dominic finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. What are you talking about? I explained what had happened, from the fake landlord, to Dad's presence on my stairway to Mrs. Petrov's intervention. Dominic listened without interrupting, but I could hear him moving around, probably pacing in his perfectly curated apartment. Jesus, Kira, I knew they were worried about you, but this is... He trailed off. This is what, Dom? This is way beyond anything I thought they would do. They've been talking about finding ways to get you to move home, but I thought they meant offering you a job or helping with student loans. Not this. Something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. What else have they been talking about? Another long pause. Look, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but they've been meeting with financial advisors a lot lately, and they've been asking weird questions about you. What kind of questions? About your living situation, your income, whether you have any savings. They wanted to know if you had ever asked me for money or mentioned having financial problems. My stomach clenched. Why would they want to know that? I don't know, but Kira, there's something else. About 2 months ago, Mom asked me if I thought you would be willing to sign some paperwork if they offered to pay off your student loans. What kind of paperwork? She didn't say exactly, but she mentioned something about family trusts and making sure assets were properly distributed. I didn't think much of it at the time because you know how Mom gets about financial planning, but now it was starting to make sense. My parents weren't just trying to control where I lived, they needed me to sign something, and they believed I would be more compliant if I was financially desperate and living under their roof. Dom, do you know anything about family trust? Like, have Mom and Dad set up any kind of inheritance structure? Not that I know of, but honestly, they don't include me in those conversations. They handle all the business finances themselves. After I hung up with Dominic, I sat staring at my laptop screen, trying to piece together a puzzle that was becoming more complicated by the hour. My parents had spent thousands of dollars hiring a professional manipulator to terrorize me into moving home. They had been researching my financial situation, and they wanted me to sign paperwork related to family trust. There was only one conclusion that made sense. Somewhere in my family's financial structure, there was money that required my participation to access, and my independence was threatening their ability to control it. I was still mulling over this theory when Zara arrived with dinner and a determined expression. She had spent her day doing the kind of investigative journalism that made her professors consistently praise her work, and she had uncovered information that changed everything. Your parents' business isn't doing as well as they pretend, she said without preamble, unpacking Thai food containers on my small dining table. I looked up the public records for Valdez Home Staging, and they've taken out 3 business loans in the past 18 months. They're also behind on property taxes for their Lake Oswego house. I stopped in the middle of opening a container of pad Thai. How did you find that out? Property tax information is public record, and business loan information shows up in certain databases if you know where to look. Your parents are in financial trouble, Kira, real trouble. Zara pulled out her laptop and showed me screenshots of county records, loan documents, and business filing. The picture they painted was of a company that was struggling to stay afloat, and owners who were leveraging everything they owned to keep it running. But that doesn't explain why they would need me to sign anything. I said. I'm not involved in their business. No, but you might be involved in something else. Kira, when did your grandmother die? The question seemed to come out of nowhere. About 5 years ago. Why? Did she leave a will? I assumed so, but I was never told about any inheritance. My parents handled everything. Zara leaned forward, her journalist instincts clearly pinging. What if she did leave you something, and your parents have been managing it until you reach a certain age or meet certain conditions? The possibility hit me like cold water. My grandmother had always been fond of me, often commenting that I was the artistic one in the family, the one who would do something meaningful with my life. She had also been independently wealthy, having invested wisely in Portland real estate decades before the market exploded. You think there's money that I don't know about? I think there's money that your parents have been controlling, and now something has changed that requires your direct involvement. Maybe you're reaching an age where the trust activates, or maybe there are conditions about your living situation that they're trying to manipulate. That evening, I called the one person who might have answers, my grandmother's longtime friend and neighbor, Eleanor Fitzpatrick. Eleanor was in her 80s now, but she had been my grandmother's closest confidant and the executor of her estate. Kira, dear. Eleanor's voice was warm but surprised. I haven't heard from you in so long. How are you doing? I'm well, Miss Fitzpatrick. But I have some questions about Grandma Rose's will. I'm wondering if there's anything I should know about that my parents might not have mentioned. The pause was telling. Oh, sweetheart, you don't know, do you? My heart started racing. No, your grandmother left you her entire art collection and a substantial trust fund. The trust was set up to become available to you on your 25th birthday, which is coming up in a few months. She was very specific that it was meant to support your artistic endeavors and ensure your independence. I sat down heavily on my bed, trying to process what Eleanor was telling me. How much money are we talking about? The last time I checked with the bank, the trust was worth approximately $400,000, plus the art collection, which is quite valuable. Your grandmother was very proud of her Rothko sketch and the small Picasso print she inherited from her own mother. $400,000, enough to pay off my student loans, buy a house and fund my art therapy practice for years, money that would make me completely financially independent from my parents. Mrs. Fitzpatrick, who has been managing your parents, as your legal guardians when you were a minor. But the terms of the trust specify that control transfers directly to you on your 25th birthday, regardless of your living situation or relationship with them. Unless I realized they could prove I was financially incompetent or unable to manage my own affairs, unless they could demonstrate that I was unstable, unemployed, or living in unsuitable conditions. Has anyone contacted you recently about the trust? My parents, or lawyers, or financial advisors? Eleanor's voice became cautious. Well, yes, your mother called a few weeks ago asking about the procedures for delaying the trust transfer. She said you were going through a difficult time and might not be ready for such a large responsibility. Everything clicked into place. My parents weren't just trying to control where I lived, they were trying to maintain control over my inheritance. If they could demonstrate that I was irresponsible or unstable, they might be able to delay the trust transfer, or even have themselves appointed as permanent trustees. The fake eviction wasn't just about getting me to move home. It was about creating evidence that I was living in unsuitable conditions, that I was unable to maintain stable housing, that I needed their guidance and supervision. Mrs. Fitzpatrick, is there any way they could actually delay the trust transfer? Only with a court order demonstrating that you're mentally incompetent or unable to manage your affairs. But Kira, from what I can tell, you're doing quite well for yourself. You're finishing graduate school, you have stable housing, and you're building a career. I can't imagine any court would find you incompetent. After I hung up with Eleanor, I called Mrs. Petrov immediately. She listened to everything I had learned, asking sharp questions and taking notes like the lawyer she used to be. This explains a great deal, she said when I finished. Your parents are facing financial difficulties. They've been managing a substantial trust that's about to slip out of their control, and they hired a professional to help them create evidence of your incompetence. What do I do now? Now we document everything, and we prepare for them to escalate their efforts. If $400,000 is at stake, they won't give up after one failed attempt. Mrs. Petrov was right. Saturday morning brought a new development that confirmed my parents were far from finished with their scheme. I woke up to find a notice taped to the bookstore's front door, claiming that the building had been reported for code violations and would be inspected by the city on Monday morning. But when I called the city's code enforcement office, they had no record of any complaints about Miss Petrov's building. The notice was fake, just like the eviction papers had been. This time, however, I was ready. I photographed the fake notice from every angle, documented the time and circumstances of its discovery, and immediately forwarded everything to Officer Martinez, who had given me her card after the previous incident. I also did something my parents probably weren't expecting. I called Eleanor Fitzpatrick back and asked her to meet me at the bank where my trust was held. That afternoon, Eleanor and I sat across from a bank manager named Robert Kim, who confirmed everything Eleanor had told me and more. The trust was indeed worth just over $400,000. It would transfer to my control automatically on my 25th birthday in 3 months, and my parents had been making increasingly desperate inquiries about ways to delay or prevent the transfer. They've asked about mental competency evaluations, financial literacy requirements, and whether living arrangements could be considered as factors in determining readiness. Mr. Kim explained, I've had to remind them several times that the trust terms are very specific and cannot be altered without clear evidence of incapacity. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Between you and me, Valdez, your parents seem to believe they have more control over this trust than they actually do. Your grandmother was very thorough in her planning, and she specifically included language to prevent family interference. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing everything I had learned over the past 2 days. My parents were financially desperate. I was about to inherit enough money to be completely independent, and they had hired a professional manipulator to help them maintain control over my life and my inheritance. But I wasn't the same person they had tried to terrorize 2 days ago. I had allies, information, and most importantly, I had legal rights they couldn't circumvent through manipulation and fraud. As I prepared for bed, I realized I was actually looking forward to Sunday dinner, not because I wanted to pretend everything was normal, but because I was ready to see just how far they were willing to go. And thanks to Mrs. Petrov's legal expertise and Zara's investigative skills, I would be ready for whatever they tried next. My phone buzzed with one final text from my mother. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. We have some exciting family news to share. I screenshot the message and added it to my evidence folder, which was growing thicker by the hour. Then I turned off my phone and settled into bed, already planning how I would handle whatever exciting family news they had prepared for me. They thought they were manipulating me into their web of control and deception. What they didn't realize was that they had given me every tool I needed to break free permanently. Sunday arrived with the kind of deceptive sunshine that makes October in Portland feel like a gift. But I spent the morning preparing for what I suspected would be psychological warfare disguised as family dinner. Mrs. Petrov had helped me set up a recording app on my phone, and Zara had coached me on how to ask leading questions that might prompt my parents to reveal more than they intended. The drive to Lake Oswego felt longer than usual, probably because I was dreading what awaited me at the end of. My parents' house sat on a tree-lined street where every lawn was perfectly manicured, and every driveway held cars that cost more than most people's annual salary. It was the kind of neighborhood that prioritized appearance above all else, which had always felt suffocating but now seemed almost sinister. I parked behind my father's BMW and took a deep breath before walking up the stone pathway to the front door. Through the large windows I could see my family gathered in the living room, and for a moment the scene looked almost normal. My mother was arranging flowers in a crystal vase, my father was reading something on his tablet, and Dominic was scrolling through his phone, probably curating content for his Instagram account. But I knew now what lay beneath the surface of this domestic tableau, and the knowledge made my skin crawl. My mother opened the door before I could knock, enveloping me in a hug that felt more possessive than affectionate. "Kira, you look wonderful, sweetheart. Come in. Your father's been working on his barbecue sauce all morning." The house smelled like garlic and herbs, warm and inviting in a way that would have comforted me just a week ago. Now it felt like a trap baited with familiar scents and childhood memory. My father emerged from the kitchen wearing an apron that read, "Grill Master," and beaming at me with the kind of enthusiasm that immediately put me on guard. Vincent Valdez was many things, but enthusiastic about my presence was not typically one of them. "There's our girl," he said, pulling me into a hug that lasted just a beat too long. "We've missed you so much. It feels like we never see you anymore." Dominic looked up from his phone and gave me a nod that seemed almost apologetic. I wondered how much he knew about what our parents had planned for today. "So," my mother said, linking her arm through mine and guiding me toward the living room, "tell us everything. How's school? How's your little apartment? Are you keeping up with your rent okay?" The questions felt like fishing expeditions, probing for information they could use against me later. I kept my answers vague and cheerful, matching their energy while staying alert for whatever was coming next. Dinner was an elaborate production featuring all of my supposed favorite foods, from the barbecue my father had been perfecting to the lemon bars my mother claimed to have made just for me. The conversation stayed light and superficial, touching on safe topics like the weather, local restaurant recommendations, and Dominic's latest brand partnerships, but I could feel the tension building beneath the pleasantries, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. My parents kept exchanging glances, and my mother's smile was becoming increasingly strained as the meal progressed. Finally, as we were clearing the dinner plates, my mother made her move. "Actually, Kira, we do have some exciting news to share with you," she said, her voice taking on the artificially bright tone she used when she was about to say something she knew I wouldn't like. "Your father and I have been doing some financial planning lately, and we've discovered some wonderful opportunities for our family." My father nodded enthusiastically, setting down his coffee cup and leaning forward in his chair. "We've been meeting with some excellent financial advisors, and they've helped us understand how we can better support you as you finish school and start your career." Here it comes, I thought, activating the recording app on my phone. "The thing is," my mother continued, "we've realized that you're probably struggling more than you want to admit. Living expenses in Portland are so high, and we know graduate school stipends don't cover much. We don't want you to feel like you have to suffer in some tiny apartment just to prove your independence." "My apartment is fine," I said carefully. "I'm managing my expenses just fine." My father waved dismissively. "Sweetheart, you don't need to pretend with us. We know that place you're renting is barely habitable, and we've heard concerning things about your landlord." I felt my pulse quicken but kept my voice steady. "What kind of concerning thing?" "Well," my mother said, glancing at my father, "we've heard that there might be some legal issues with the property, code violations, safety concerns, that sort of thing. We're just worried about you living in an unstable situation." It was fascinating to watch them construct their narrative in real time, building a foundation of lies they could use to justify their next move. I decided to push back gently and see how they would respond. "I haven't heard anything about code violations. Miss Petrov is a wonderful landlord, and the building is in excellent condition. Where did you hear about legal issues?" My parents exchanged another glance, and I could see them recalibrating their approach. "The important thing," my father said, steering the conversation away from specifics, is that we want to help. We've been thinking about ways to support you financially, and we've come up with what we think is a perfect solution. My mother reached for a manila folder that had been sitting on the kitchen counter, the same type of folder that had contained the fake eviction notice just 3 days earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. "We want to set up a family trust," she said, pulling out several official-looking documents. "It would provide you with a steady income throughout graduate school and beyond, enough to cover all your living expenses and give you real financial security." I pretended to examine the documents while actually studying my parents' faces. They were both watching me intently, like predators gauging their prey's reaction. "This is very generous," I said slowly, "but I'm curious about the details. What would I need to do to access this trust?" "Oh, it's quite simple," my father said, his tone becoming more animated. "You would just need to sign some paperwork establishing the trust and agreeing to its terms. Very standard stuff." "And what are the terms?" My mother's smile flickered slightly. "Well, the trust would be managed by us, of course, since we have more experience with financial planning. And there would be some reasonable conditions to ensure the money is used responsibly." "What kind of conditions?" "Nothing restrictive," my father said quickly. "Just basic things like maintaining stable housing, staying in touch with family, making smart financial decisions. The kind of things any responsible adult would do anyway." I could see where this was heading. They were trying to create a legal structure that would give them control over my life, while making it sound like they were doing me a favor. The fact that they were attempting this just months before my real inheritance became available was not a coincidence. "Could I take some time to think about this?" I asked. "Maybe have a lawyer look over the documents." The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. My parents' carefully constructed facades began to crack, revealing the desperation underneath. "Why would you need a lawyer?" my mother asked, her voice sharpening. "We're your family. We're trying to help you." "I know, but this is a big financial decision. I just want to make sure I understand everything before I sign anything." My father's jaw tightened. "Kira, we've spent a lot of time and money setting this up for you. The least you could do is show some appreciation, instead of immediately looking for reasons to be suspicious." There it was. The guilt, the manipulation, the emotional pressure designed to make me comply without thinking. It was a pattern I recognized from my entire childhood, but now I could see it clearly for what it was. "I do appreciate it," I said calmly. "That's exactly why I want to make sure I handle it properly." Dominic, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. "Maybe Kira has a point. Legal documents are complicated. It probably makes sense to have someone review them." My parents turned on him with a fury that was startling in its intensity. "Dominic, this doesn't concern you," my mother snapped. "And Kira, I'm frankly hurt that you would question our motives after everything we've done for you." "What you've done for me," the words came out more sharply than I had intended, but I was getting tired of their performance. "Like hiring someone to serve me fake eviction paper." The silence that followed was deafening. My parents stared at me with expressions of shock that might have been convincing if I hadn't known better. "What are you talking about?" my father asked, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm talking about Marcus Hoffman, the man you hired to pose as my landlord and terrorize me into moving out of my apartment. Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out?" My mother's face went white. "Kira, I don't know where you got that idea, but I got that idea from the police report I filed after Mrs. Petrov called 911 on your fake landlord. I got that idea from Marcus Hoffman's website, where he advertises family intervention service. I got that idea from watching Dad hide behind a tree while his hired thug tried to intimidate me." The pretense was over. My parents looked at each other with the desperate expression of people whose carefully laid plans had just imploded. "We were just trying to help," my mother said weakly. "We were worried about you living in that place, and we thought if you came home temporarily, you thought if you could prove I was unstable and living in unsuitable conditions, you could delay my inheritance." I said flatly. "You thought you could maintain control over Grandma Rose's trust fund by manufacturing evidence that I'm incompetent." My father's face flushed red. That money is complicated, Kira. There are tax implications and investment strategies that you don't understand. We've been protecting your interests by stealing from me. We haven't stolen anything, my mother protested. We've been managing that money responsibly, making sure it grows and is available when you're truly ready for it. I'll be 25 in 3 months, according to the trust documents. I'll be ready whether you think so or not. Dominic looked confused. What trust? What inheritance? I turned to my brother, realizing that our parents had kept him in the dark about this entire situation. Grandma Rose left me $400,000 and her art collection. Mom and Dad have been managing it, but it transfers to me automatically on my 25th birthday. Dominic's eyes widened. $400,000. And you never told me. Our parents' unity began to fracture as they realized they were losing control of the narrative on multiple fronts. It wasn't relevant to you, my father said defensively. And Kira, you're being dramatic. We've always planned to transfer the money to you when the time was right. The time was right 5 years ago when Grandma died. The time will be legally mandated in 3 months. What you've been doing is buying time to figure out how to keep money that was never yours. My mother started crying, but they were the calculated tears of someone who had used emotion as a weapon for so long that she couldn't distinguish between genuine feeling and manipulation. We're in trouble, Kira, she said, through her sobs. The business is struggling, and we've made some bad investments. We just need some time to get back on our feet. So you decided to commit fraud instead of asking for help? We were going to pay it back, my father said desperately. Once the business recovered, we were going to make sure you got every penny. With interest, I looked around the beautifully decorated dining room, taking in the expensive furniture, the original artwork, the crystal chandelier that probably cost more than my annual rent. You were going to pay me back with what money? You've already spent it, haven't you? The silence was answer enough. I stood up from the table, gathering my purse and jacket. I'm leaving now. Don't contact me again unless it's through lawyers. Kira, please. My mother pleaded. We're still your family. We can work this out. Family doesn't hire fake landlords to terrorize each other. Family doesn't steal inheritances. Family doesn't manipulate and lie and gaslight their own children. I walked toward the front door, but my father stepped in front of me, his desperation finally overriding his calculated approach. You can't just walk away from us, he said, his voice taking on a threatening edge. We know things about you, about your life. We can make things very difficult if you choose to be vindictive about this. I looked at him calmly, pulling out my phone and stopping the recording app. Are you threatening me, Dad? The question seemed to snap him back to reality. He stepped aside, his face pale. I'm documenting everything, I told them both. Every lie, every manipulation, every illegal thing you've done. If you try to interfere with my inheritance or my life in any way, I'll make sure the police, the bank, and anyone else who needs to know gets copies of everything I've collected. I opened the front door and stepped out into the cool evening air. Oh, and if you're wondering how I found out about the trust fund, Eleanor Fitzpatrick sends her regards. She's been very helpful in explaining exactly what rights I have and what you've been doing wrong. I walked to my car without looking back, but I could hear my mother's wails through the open door and my father's furious voice as he presumably realized that their game was over. As I drove away from the house where I had grown up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete clarity about who my family really was and what I needed to do to protect myself from them. The recording on my phone contained everything I needed to prove that they had orchestrated the fake eviction attempt and that they were trying to defraud me out of my inheritance. Combined with the evidence Miss Petrov and I had already collected, it would be more than enough to ensure that my trust fund transferred to me without interference. But more importantly, it was enough to free me from the illusion that I owed them anything just because we shared DNA. I drove straight to Miss Petrov's house, where I found her and Zara waiting with tea and the kind of determined expressions that suggested they had been planning something while I was gone. How did it go? Mrs. Petrov asked, as I settled into her comfortable living room. Better than I expected, I said, playing the recording for them. They basically confessed to everything. Zara grinned. Perfect, Because we have some news that's going to make your week even better. She pulled out her laptop and showed me a series of emails and documents she had uncovered through her journalism contacts. Marcus Hoffman is in trouble, she announced. Big trouble. Turns out your parents aren't his only clients who've gotten him involved in fraudulent schemes. The state attorney general's office has been building a case against him for months, and they're very interested in talking to his recent victims. Mrs. Petrov leaned forward. We've already contacted the prosecutor handling the case. They want to interview you this week. I sat back in my chair, processing this new development. So this could be bigger than just my situation? Much bigger, Zara confirmed. Hoffman has been running these family manipulation schemes all over Oregon and Washington. Your case could be the one that brings down his entire operation. That night, I lay in my own bed in my own apartment, listening to the familiar sounds of the city and feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Complete peace. My parents had shown their true colors, I had documented their crimes, and I was about to become financially independent, whether they liked it or not. But the best part wasn't the money or the legal victory. The best part was knowing that I would never again have to wonder whether their love was conditional or their support came with strings attached. I had my answer, recorded in their own voices, and it had set me free. Monday morning brought unexpected chaos in the form of multiple missed calls from my brother Dominic and a text that simply read, "Emergency at the house. Mom's lost it. Dad's talking about lawyers. Need to talk ASAP." I was sitting in Miss Petrov's kitchen, sharing coffee and reviewing the timeline of events we would present to the state attorney general's office later that day, when my phone started buzzing incessantly. The contrast between the peaceful domestic scene and the obvious panic in my brother's messages was almost comical. Mrs. Petrov raised an eyebrow as I declined another call from Dominic. Family drama escalating? Apparently, I said, showing her the text. Dom seems to think there's some kind of crisis happening. There is a crisis, she said dryly. Your parents are facing criminal charges for fraud, their business is failing, and they've just lost access to $400,000 they've been treating as their personal piggy bank. I'd call that a crisis. When I finally called Dominic back, his voice was strained and exhausted. Kira, thank God. Look, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but you need to know what's happening here. What's happening there is what happens when people commit crimes, I said evenly. I'm not responsible for cleaning up their mess. I get that. I really do. But Kira, Mom hasn't stopped crying since you left last night. She's talking about taking pills or driving her car into a tree. And Dad's on the phone with some expensive lawyer who's telling him he could go to prison. I felt a familiar stab of guilt, the automatic response I'd been conditioned to have whenever my family was in crisis. But this time, I recognized it for what it was, manipulation, even when delivered by my well-meaning brother. Dom, I'm sorry they're upset, but they brought this on themselves. They hired someone to commit fraud against me. They stole my inheritance. They tried to manipulate me into signing away my legal rights. These are the consequences of their choices. I know, but maybe there's a way to handle this privately. As a family, they made it public when they involved the police with their fake eviction scheme. They made it criminal when they hired Marcus Hoffman. There's no putting this back in the box. Dominic was quiet for a long moment. The lawyer wants to know if you'd be willing to meet, to discuss a settlement. A settlement for what? They don't have anything I want except my own money, which I'm getting anyway in 3 months. They're hoping you might be willing to drop the criminal charges in exchange for immediate access to the trust fund, and some kind of compensation for what they put you through. I almost laughed. Dom, they can't drop criminal charges on my behalf. The state attorney general is building a case against Marcus Hoffman, and my parents are witnesses, suspects, or both. This isn't about me being vindictive. This is about a pattern of criminal behavior that goes way beyond our family. After I hung up with Dominic, Mrs. Petrov and I drove downtown to meet with Assistant Attorney General Sarah Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in white-collar crime. Her office was in one of Portland's newer high-rises, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Willamette River. Sarah Chen was nothing like what I had expected from a government prosecutor. She was warm but direct, asking probing questions while somehow making me feel like I was having coffee with a trusted mentor rather than being interviewed by law enforcement. Valdez, I want you to understand that what happened to you is part of a much larger pattern, she said, spreading several files across her conference table. Marcus Hoffman has been operating his family intervention business for almost 3 years, and we've identified at least 12 other victims across Oregon and Washington. She showed me photographs and case summaries that made my stomach turn. A 26-year-old woman whose parents had hired Hoffman to stage a fake drug intervention, complete with actors posing as counselor. A 30-year-old man whose family had convinced him he was having a mental breakdown by hiring people to gaslight him about conversations that had never happened. A 24-year-old whose parents had orchestrated an elaborate scheme involving fake job offers to manipulate her into moving back home. The common thread, Sarah explained, is wealthy families who feel they're losing control over adult children, often because of inheritance issues or family business concerns. Hoffman specializes in psychological manipulation designed to make victims doubt their own competence and independence. How is this legal? I asked, horrified by what I was seeing. Most of it isn't. That's why we're prosecuting. But Hoffman operates in gray areas, and his clients often don't understand that they're crossing into criminal territory. Your case is particularly valuable to us because you documented everything so thoroughly and because your landlord is a former attorney who understood the legal implications immediately. Sarah played my recording from the family dinner, taking notes as my parents' voices filled the conference room. When it ended, she looked up with the satisfied expression of a prosecutor who had just heard a confession. This is excellent evidence, Ms. Valdez. Your parents have essentially admitted to conspiracy to commit fraud, and they've implicated Marcus Hoffman in the process. Combined with the physical evidence you've collected and Mrs. Petrov's testimony, we have a very strong case. What happens next? We'll be issuing warrants for Marcus Hoffman's arrest this week. Your parents will likely be charged as co-conspirators, though the exact charges will depend on what else we uncover during the investigation. As for your trust fund, the bank has already been notified that there's an active criminal investigation, so the money is now in a protected status until this is resolved. I felt a chill of concern. What does that mean for my access to the inheritance? It means no one can touch it until we determine the full extent of any financial crimes. The good news is that since you're the legitimate beneficiary, you'll eventually get everything that's rightfully yours. The bad news is that it might take several months to sort out. That afternoon, I returned to my apartment to find Zara waiting with takeout from our favorite Vietnamese restaurant and a laptop full of research that she was clearly excited to share. You're not going to believe what I found, she said, unpacking spring rolls and fall while simultaneously pulling up browser windows. Remember how your parents kept talking about bad investments and business troubles? I nodded, settling in for what I suspected would be another revelation that made my family's behavior even more appalling than I had thought. I did some digging into their business finances, and it's worse than we thought. They didn't just make bad investments, they made criminally bad investments. Zara showed me a series of documents she had obtained through public records requests and financial databases that journalism students had access to. The picture that emerged was of a couple who had been living far beyond their means for years, using credit and borrowed money to maintain a lifestyle they couldn't afford. Look at this, she said, pointing to a bank document. 2 years ago, they took out a home equity loan for $200,000. The loan application lists the collateral as their house, plus family trust assets under management. They used my inheritance as collateral for their personal loan. It gets worse. 6 months later, they invested most of that money in a cryptocurrency scheme that turned out to be a Ponzi operation. They lost everything. I stared at the documents, trying to process the implication. So they've already spent my inheritance money on a scam investment, and now they owe the bank $200,000 they don't have. Exactly. And when the bank comes looking for the collateral they promised, they're going to discover that the family trust assets never actually belonged to them in the first place. The scope of my parents' financial crimes was becoming clearer and more devastating by the hour. They hadn't just stolen my inheritance, they had used it to secure loans they couldn't repay, invested it in fraudulent schemes, and now faced bankruptcy and criminal prosecution. There's more, Zara continued. I found records showing that they've been systematically draining the trust fund for almost 2 years. The $400,000 your grandmother left you, it's down to about $50,000. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. 50,000, but the bank manager said the trust was worth over 400,000. That's what the paperwork shows, but the actual liquid assets are much lower. They've been creating fake investment statements to hide how much they've withdrawn. My phone rang, interrupting my attempt to process this new information. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the voice was familiar and unwelcome. "Kira, this is Marcus Hoffman. I think we need to talk." Mrs. Petrov, who had arrived just in time to hear my side of the conversation, immediately gestured for me to put the call on speaker. "Mr. Hoffman, I don't think we have anything to discuss. You can talk to my lawyer or the Attorney General's office." "Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice losing its professional polish and taking on a threatening edge. "Your parents hired me to provide a service, and I provided it. If you think you can destroy my business over a simple misunderstanding, you're making a very dangerous mistake." Mrs. Petrov was already dialing 911 while gesturing for me to keep him talking. "Is that a threat, Mr. Hoffman?" "It's a reality check. I have clients who don't appreciate interference in their family affairs, people with resources and connection. If you continue pursuing this vindictive path, you might find that your problems are just beginning." "Are you threatening physical harm?" "I'm explaining consequences. Back off, or face them." The call ended, leaving the three of us staring at each other in my small apartment. The police arrived within minutes, taking a statement about the threatening call and adding it to the growing file of evidence against Marcus Hoffman. Officer Martinez, who had responded to the original fake eviction incident, shook her head as she reviewed the case note. "This guy just keeps digging himself deeper. Threatening a witness in an active criminal investigation is a felony all by itself." That evening brought another surprise in the form of my father appearing at my apartment door. He looked haggard and desperate, wearing clothes that were wrinkled and stained, a far cry from his usual carefully curated appearance. "Kira, please, I need 5 minutes to explain." Ms. Petrov, who had insisted on staying with me after the threatening phone call, appeared behind me in the doorway. "Mr. Valdez, I don't think this is appropriate given the circumstances. Please," he said, his voice breaking. "I just need her to understand that we never meant for it to go this far." Against my better judgment, I let him into my apartment, though Mrs. Petrov remained close by, and I kept my phone ready to call for help if needed. My father sat heavily on my small couch, looking around my studio apartment as if seeing it for the first time. "This place is actually nice," he said, absently. "I never really looked at it before." "Dad, what do you want?" "I want to fix this. Your mother is falling apart, the business is gone, and we're looking at bankruptcy and possibly prison. But more than that, I want you to know that we love you." "You have a strange way of showing love. We were scared, Kira. Scared of losing everything we'd worked for. Scared of admitting that we'd made terrible mistakes. When we realized how much money we'd lost from your trust fund, we panicked. So you decided to commit more crimes instead of telling me the truth." He rubbed his face with hands that shook slightly. "Marcus Hoffman convinced us that we could fix everything quietly. He said, if we could just get you back home and under our guidance for a few months, we could find a way to replace the money and no one would ever need to know. By creating fake documents and terrorizing me into compliance. By helping you see that independence isn't always what it's cracked up to be. By showing you that family support matters more than proving a point." I stared at him, trying to find some trace of the father I had once respected. "Do you hear you're still trying to manipulate me even now? You're not here to apologize or make amends. You're here to try one more guilt trip. I'm here because I love you and I don't want to lose you completely. You lost me the moment you hired Marcus Hoffman. You lost me when you decided my inheritance was yours to steal. You lost me when you chose manipulation over honesty." My father started to cry, but even his tears felt calculated, designed to evoke sympathy rather than express genuine remorse. "What can I do to fix this? You can face the consequences of your actions like an adult. You can cooperate with the prosecutor's investigation. You can tell the truth for once in your life." He left without saying goodbye, and I watched from my window as he sat in his car in the parking lot for almost an hour before finally driving away. The next morning brought news that Marcus Hoffman had been arrested at his home in Beaverton, charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, and threatening a witness. The local news coverage showed him being led away in handcuffs, his professional facade completely shattered. But the real shock came that afternoon, when Eleanor Fitzpatrick called with news that changed everything. "Kira, dear, I hope you're sitting down. I've just been contacted by your grandmother's estate attorney with some very interesting information." "What kind of information?" "It seems your grandmother was more suspicious of your parents than any of us realized. She set up a secondary trust that even I didn't know about. One that activates if there's ever evidence of financial malfeasance regarding your primary inheritance." I gripped the phone tight. "What does that mean?" "It means your grandmother anticipated that your parents might try to steal from you, and she created a backup plan. The secondary trust contains an additional $200,000, plus her entire art collection, plus ownership of a small rental property in Southeast Portland." I sat down heavily on my bed, trying to process what Eleanor was telling me. "The attorney says the secondary trust activates automatically when certain conditions are met, including criminal charges related to the primary trust. Given recent events, you're now entitled to claim those assets immediately. So even though my parents stole most of my original inheritance, I'm still going to be financially secure. More than secure, dear. Your grandmother was a very wise woman who loved you more than you knew." That evening, I sat in Miss Petr's garden with Zara, watching the sunset and trying to wrap my mind around how dramatically my life had changed in just 1 week. I had gone from being a struggling graduate student, to being the victim of an elaborate fraud, to being the key witness in a criminal investigation, to being significantly wealthier than I had ever imagined possible. But the money, while life-changing, wasn't the most important thing I had gained. I had gained clarity about who my family really was, strength I didn't know I possessed, and allies who had proven themselves when it mattered most. "So what happens now?" Zara asked, refilling our wine glasses. "Now I testify against Marcus Hoffman, and probably my parents too. Now I finish graduate school without worrying about money. Now I figure out what kind of life I want to build with the freedom my grandmother gave me." Mrs. Petrov smiled from across the small table. "And now you help other people who find themselves in similar situations. Your grandmother would be proud of what you've accomplished this week." As if summoned by her words, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I saw the news about Marcus Hoffman. My parents hired him too. "Can we talk?" I showed the message to Miss Petrov and Zara, who both nodded knowingly. "It begins," Mrs. Petrov said softly. "The real work starts now." I looked at the message again, thinking about the files Sarah Chen had shown me, the other victims who had suffered through schemes similar to mine. My legal battle was nearly over, but my ability to help others was just beginning. I typed back, "Yes, let's." 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of the Multnomah County Courthouse, watching Marcus Hoffman being sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, and witness intimidation. His business had been completely dismantled, his assets seized, and his client list had become evidence in multiple ongoing criminal investigations across the Pacific Northwest. My parents sat 3 rows behind me with their court-appointed attorney, having pled guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for reduced sentences and cooperation with the prosecution. They would each serve 18 months in minimum security facilities, followed by 3 years of probation and community service. Their Lake Oswego house had been foreclosed on, their business liquidated, and their social standing in their carefully curated community completely destroyed. But I wasn't there for revenge, or to witness their humiliation. I was there because Sarah Chen had asked me to speak at the sentencing hearing about the impact of Hoffman's crimes, not just on me but on the broader community of victims we had identified and helped. Standing at the podium, looking out at a courtroom filled with other families who had been torn apart by manipulation and fraud, I felt the weight of responsibility that had shaped my life over the past month. "Your Honor," I began, 6 months ago, I thought I was dealing with a family disagreement about my living situation. I had no idea I was actually the victim of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that preys on family relationships and exploits the trust between parents and children. I went on to describe how the investigation had uncovered 17 other families across Oregon and Washington who had hired Marcus Hoffman to manipulate their adult children through various forms of psychological warfare. We had connected with victims who had been gaslit, intimidated, and emotionally abused by professionals their own families had hired to break their independence. The damage extends far beyond financial loss. I continue. These crimes destroy families, shatter trust, and leave victims questioning their own reality and self-worth. The recovery process involves not just healing from the immediate trauma, but rebuilding entire belief systems about family, love, and safety. When I finished speaking, I returned to my seat next to Mrs. Petrov, who had become not just my landlord and ally but something like a surrogate grandmother. She had attended every court hearing, helped me navigate the legal system, and provided the kind of steady support I had never received from my actual family. After the sentencing, we walked out of the courthouse into a Portland spring day that felt full of possibility. The cherry trees were blooming along the waterfront, and the city hummed with the energy of renewal that came with the end of another long Pacific Northwest winter. "How do you feel?" Mrs. Petrov asked as we settled into a coffee shop near the courthouse. "Relieved," I said, surprising myself with the honesty of it. "Not vindicated or victorious, just relieved that it's over, and that other people won't have to go through what I went through." The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and personal transformation. The story of the fake eviction scheme had attracted national attention, leading to interviews with journalists, invitations to speak at conferences, and contact from victims of similar schemes across the country. But the most meaningful change had been the relationships I had built with other survivors. The woman who had texted me the night of Marcus Hoffman's arrest had been the first of many who reached out seeking support, advice, or simply someone who understood what they were experiencing. Her name was Taylor, and her parents had hired Hoffman to stage an elaborate fake intervention designed to convince her that she was having a mental breakdown. The psychological manipulation had been so sophisticated that she had actually checked herself into a psychiatric facility, believing she was losing her mind. Working with Taylor and others, I had started an informal support network that eventually became a registered nonprofit organization called the Family Fraud Recovery Project. We provided resources for victims of family-perpetrated psychological manipulation, connected people with legal and mental health services, and advocated for stronger laws to protect adult children from this type of abuse. The work was challenging and emotionally demanding, but it felt like the most important thing I had ever done. It was also made possible by the financial security my grandmother's foresight had provided. The secondary trust had indeed activated when the criminal charges were filed, giving me immediate access to funds that allowed me to finish graduate school debt-free, purchase a small house in Southeast Portland, and establish the nonprofit without worrying about personal financial survival. But perhaps more importantly, discovering the backup trust had given me insight into my grandmother's character and values that I had never fully understood while she was alive. She had known her own son well enough to anticipate his potential for financial abuse, and she had loved me enough to protect me from it even after her death. Eleanor Fitzpatrick had become a regular presence in my life, sharing stories about my grandmother that painted a picture of a woman who had been far more strategic and protective than I had realized. Grandma Rose had apparently spent years quietly documenting my parents' financial irresponsibility, and had structured her estate specifically to ensure that her legacy would support my independence rather than their control. She told me once that the most important gift she could give you was the freedom to choose your own path, Eleanor had explained during one of our monthly tea dates. She worried that your parents would try to use money to manipulate you, so she made sure that wouldn't be possible. My relationship with Dominic had slowly begun to heal, though it would never be the same as before. He had been genuinely shocked by the extent of our parents' crimes, and had cooperated fully with the investigation, providing financial records and testimony that helped prosecutors understand the scope of the fraud. But he was also dealing with his own trauma from discovering that his entire adult relationship with our parents had been built on lies and manipulation. His social media presence, which had been carefully curated to present our family as successful and harmonious, had become an embarrassing reminder of how thoroughly he had been deceived. I keep looking back at all those posts about family values and authentic living, he had told me during one of our awkward but necessary conversations. I was literally posting inspiration quotes about honesty while our parents were committing felony. Dominic was in therapy now, working through his own feelings of betrayal and guilt. We met for coffee once a month, carefully rebuilding trust while maintaining boundaries that protected both of us from falling back into old family patterns. I had not spoken to my parents since the day they were sentenced. They had each written me letters from prison, but I had returned them unopened. Miss Petrov and my therapist both supported my decision to maintain no contact, recognizing that my healing required space from people who had proven themselves unable to respect my autonomy or well-being. The house I had purchased with my inheritance money was a 1920s bungalow just a few blocks from Mrs. Petrov's building, close enough that we could maintain our friendship while giving me the space to build my own independent life. It had a large backyard where I had started a garden, a sun-filled studio where I could paint, and a spare bedroom that I used as an office for the nonprofit. But my favorite feature was the front porch where I spent most mornings drinking coffee and planning my day. It was from that porch that I had conducted many of the interviews with journalists writing about family fraud, and it was where I met with other survivors who were ready to share their stories publicly. One particular morning in late spring, I was sitting on that porch when I received a phone call that brought my transformation full circle. Ms. Valdez, this is Detective Rodriguez with the Seattle Police Department. We've been investigating a case that involves Marcus Hoffman's former associate, and we understand you've become something of an expert on these types of crime. Detective Rodriguez explained that they had arrested a woman named Patricia Mills, who had been running a similar family manipulation business in the Seattle area. Her methods were slightly different from Hoffman's, but the core concept was the same. Wealthy families hired her to psychologically manipulate their adult children into compliance. We have about 20 potential victims, but most of them don't realize they were victims. The manipulation was so subtle and sophisticated that many of them still believe their families were acting in their best interests. What can I do to help? We're hoping you might be willing to consult on the case, help us understand the psychological dynamics, and maybe reach out to some of the victims, who might be more willing to talk to someone who's been through similar experience. 6 months earlier, I would never have imagined that my personal trauma would become the foundation for meaningful work helping others, but as I agreed to assist with the Seattle investigation, I realized that this was exactly the kind of purpose my grandmother had hoped her legacy would support. That afternoon, I called Taylor to discuss the Seattle case and our strategy for reaching out to the potential victim. Our organization had developed protocols for approaching people who might not yet understand that they had been manipulated, and we had learned to be patient with the process of helping people recognize abuse disguised as love. It's going to be hard, Taylor warned. People who are still under their family's influence don't want to hear that they're being manipulated. They're going to resist us at first. I know, I said, but we have to try. Someone reached out to me when I needed it most, and look how that turned out. As evening approached, I found myself walking through my neighborhood, reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed since that October afternoon, when a fake landlord had appeared at my door. The threat that had seemed so devastating at the time had actually been the catalyst for discovering my own strength, uncovering my family's true nature, and finding my purpose in helping others navigate similar challenges. My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Petrov. Dinner tomorrow. I'm making that Ukrainian stew you like, I smiled, typing back my acceptance. Mrs. Petrov had become the family I had chosen, proving that love and support didn't have to come with manipulation and control. Her friendship had shown me what healthy relationships look like and had given me a model for the kind of family I hope to build in the future. Walking home as the sun set behind Portland's skyline, I thought about the 17 other families whose lives had been disrupted by Marcus Hoffman's schemes, and the hundreds more across the country who were probably dealing with similar manipulation without realizing it. The work ahead was enormous, but for the first time in my life, I felt equal to the challenge. I had resources, allies, and most importantly, I had learned that independence wasn't just about living alone or making your own decisions. True independence meant having the strength to recognize manipulation, the courage to resist it, and the wisdom to help others do the same. My grandmother's legacy hadn't just given me financial freedom, it had given me the power to protect others from the kind of family abuse that thrives in silence and shame. And as I unlocked the door to my own house, in my own neighborhood, surrounded by relationships I had chosen rather than inherited, I knew that was exactly what she had intended. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.